Hello and welcome to Asase, a podcast that honors oral tradition and shines a light on Ghanaian stories that are often untold or silenced. My name is Michelle and I'm your host. And I'm excited to be back for a brand new episode. This is an interview episode, great interview. And yes, I can't wait for y'all to listen to it. I took a little break last week. And so, yeah, I'm back. And I feel like I say the word excited a lot on this podcast, but I like to come back when I'm genuinely excited, you know what I mean? And so I am excited. So you'll hear that many times. But before I dive into this episode, I just really want to say that I'm super grateful for spaces that are intersectional, grateful that I can have conversations with other queer Ghanaians, other queer Black folks, other folks who don't fit into this sort of mainstream ideal of what a person is supposed to be. You know what I mean? Yeah, so just want to shout out how grateful I am for these spaces. It's just so important to me to see that, and that's why I created Asaseba. And I'm grateful for all these spaces on social media and elsewhere where queer Ghanaians um can just be themselves, be centered. And yeah, so shout out to these platforms and spaces doing a thing, and having these nuanced and layered conversations. I'm really, really grateful for them. So, yeah, so I'm happy to be back for another episode. And if you haven't been listening to the other episodes, first of all, go back and listen because they've been really great. Really great conversations with queer folks in Ghana, and also about indigenous knowledge systems, our traditions, our traditional education. And I talk about that through a nuanced lens. So I'm really happy about that episode. So go check those out if you haven't already. And if you enjoyed this podcast and something resonates with you, you can support in several ways. So the first way is by sharing the podcast. Asaseba is on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. TikTok, I gotta admit, I gotta go on there some more and just kind of try, but I'll get there again soon and try to, post some content on there. But nonetheless, you can still support by, retweeting on Twitter, posting on your Insta stories, sharing on WhatsApp, telling your friends, your community, your network, your family, and just engaging and using the hashtag asasebapod, ASASEBAPOD, so that I can see your thoughts, other people can see your thoughts, and we can just keep these conversations going. I love hearing your thoughts. It just makes me so happy. And yes, you can also rate this podcast 5 stars on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening to it. And you can visit asasebapod.com for curated resources on queer identity, spirituality, and cultural work. We also have podcast transcripts on there as well. They're work in progress. But, the goal is to have all transcripts for every episode. But they are there for season 1 through to season 3. And I'm working on the others as well. So stay tuned for that. Another way to support the podcast is through monetary donations. Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm the sole producer, editor, audio engineer, interviewer, and I really, really enjoy doing this podcast. I have a passion for it. It's a labor of love, but it's still work. And so if you'd like to support me as an indie creator, you can do so by donating via email transfer for those in Canada. If you're outside of Canada, you can donate via PayPal, and the email for that is asasebapod@gmail.com. So that's ASASEBAPOD@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. All right, so today I have a very special guest, and their name is Moco. Moco, pronouns they, them, is based in Los Angeles, California. They're a recent university graduate with a degree in biology. They love Black history and culture, and they're an animal lover. And Moco runs a platform about Afro-Jamaican history and culture, and it's an amazing platform. And that's basically what we talk about in this episode. And specifically, Moco joins me to talk about Afro-Jamaicans and their connection to ethnic groups from Ghana, the Koromantees and the Maroons of Jamaica, similarities in our food, music, spirituality. We also discuss some of the experiences of trans folks, queer folks in Jamaica and the Jamaica diaspora, and much, much more. This was such a great conversation, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts. And you can do so, through the hashtag asasebapod. And yes, let's get into it. Welcome to Asase podcast, Moco. I'm really happy to have you here. Can you start by introducing yourself?
Yes, so my name is Moco. I am from Los Angeles. Um, I have an account named Root in Jamaica, and essentially I center the Africans on that island and the diaspora, and get into some historical and social work that involves the Afro-Jamaicans there. And yeah, that's a little about me, pronouns they, them.
Yes, thank you. And I mean, I realized I didn't ask this, but I obviously just assumed you are a Jamaican, right?
Yeah.
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 I actually am not. um, okay, awesome. So tell us a little bit more about your platform, why you created it, who it's for, and what you want people to take away from it.
Yeah, so I created the platform a couple years ago because um in terms of like looking for history, Afro-Jamaican history that actually centers who Afro-Jamaicans were prior to the 1900s, you're not really getting too much on their lives, their culture, their traditions. I really wanted to get into the specifics of that. I didn't really business about how they made, Europeans rich. I didn't really business about like how much, sugar cane they produced for Europe. That wasn't really something I was interested in. I wanted to get into who these people are who are running through my veins. And so I created the platform to essentially censor that, but also have an analysis on the legacy of colonialism and all the vestiges that comes with that. Because oftentimes when we talk about history, um, sometimes that portion of it gets left out. That not all the time it's cute, not all the time it's comfortable history. And so I really wanted to unpack systems of oppression as well as just get into who these people were. And so my platform really is for essentially the entire diaspora, the African diaspora, because I really do feel like everyone could like learn from the platform, being that I do talk about different groups around the diaspora and the ways in which we are connected. Because really and truly, we share a lot of history, we share a lot of culture, we share a lot of traditions. A piece of we is in everybody, because we were scattered over the past 300 years. Migrations occurred, displacement occurred. And so it's for the diaspora, but specifically, I wanted to create a platform centering queer and trans people, or rather, since that I am trans myself, I wanted to have me sort of create this space so that no one has to worry about the patriarchy, the queer and transphobia that occurs when people are retelling history, because of course, certain voices and certain identities are silenced in the retelling of history. And I just wanted for it to be a safe space for all Black people, all African people, and to really get into the history in a real and truthful manner.
Yes, yes, I love that. And like, it's so important what you mentioned about
you specifically creating a safe space, you know, free from misogyny, homophobia, transphobia,
Mm-hmm.
because even in something I've come across when like doing research, trying to learn more about like, for example, Akan spirituality or other sort of cultural elements, or even just like pre-colonial history, that kind of thing. Even when I end up with resources that is created by like Ghanaians, most of the time or some of the time, it's like, damn, the misogyny is rampant in here. This is, you know what I mean? So it sucks when it's like, okay, I'm not gonna read or consume the resources that like the white people created. Because
Mm-hmm.
during a certain period, you find that a lot of the research and scholarship on that specific topic is by white people. And then
Mm-hmm.
after that period, it's like you start to find more resources written by like, you know, people from that cultural group. But then it's
Mm-hmm.
like, damn, I'm still encountering like other forms of oppression, like misogyny,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. So I think
Mm-hmm.
it's so important that you mentioned that you're really trying to create that safe space so that when a queer person or trans person, someone, you know, is on your platform, they don't have to worry that they're just going to be like encountering some sort of bigotry, you know? So thanks for
Mm-hmm.
highlighting that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, definitely. I resonate with that experience like a whole lot.
Yeah, like I just actually complained about that on Twitter. So like, yeah, I'm gonna bring that up. And it's like, damn, can't escape this. Anyway,
Yeah,
yes.
especially like digital platforms as well, like well, all sort of spaces where, you know, they retell history, but particularly in digital spaces that like occurs, like you'll be scrolling, you're like, okay, this is good stuff. Bam, misogynoir. Bam, colorism.
Yeah.
Bam, transphobia. And it's like, whoa, this is literally the colonialism that I thought we were trying to intervene.
Exactly, exactly. Or it'll be like, oh, super pro black, like, but then it's
Mm-hmm.
like bigotry for every other thing, you know what I mean? So it's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
anyway. All right. So can you share a brief history of, you know, Afro-Jamaicans and the ethnic groups that came from Ghana? I know it's a long history, but if you can share, you know, something for our audience just to contextualize everything, that would be
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. So from my findings and, you know, like my research and stuff, certainly there is Afro-Jamaicans, our history, we have very strong ties with like the southern portion of Ghana. So that's mainly like the Akan groups and as well as Ga people. Um, those are like the main groups. However, we have had people from like the northern side of Ghana come into Jamaica. There's like definitely historical records of that. And so in the during slavery, those people were called Coromanti or Coromanti, and that's basically an anglicization of a English port named Cromantine. And so essentially the British named all Ghanaian captives Cromanti. But there are actually two other groups from Ghana that people don't really mention as much that were used in the slave era to describe captives from what they called the Gold Coast. It was the Chamba and the Suko. Now the Chamba were from, like I said, they were like they're from the northern parts, the Masi states, the Agomba, probably Frafra. And then you had Suko, which there's not much on them, but there seems to be like this thing where they interacted with tree speakers because on runaway slave ads it would say this person's from Suko country and they speak Cromanti. So they must have been from like the area around the Akan. Maybe they were Mande people who interacted with Akan people. So those were the three main groups, but they encompassed a lot of different subgroups like the Fanti, Achim, Aquapim, Ashanti. Those were like the Coromantee people. And like in the earlier period, It was mainly Fanti during the late 1600s because the Denchira were basically raiding villages and expanding their empire eastward. And so they were funneling people through Anamabu into Jamaica. And so that is why those people kind of like started a lot of the early revolts in Jamaica because they were kind of accustomed to war because of the Denchira. And so there's a very strong Fanti presence in Jamaica that I will get into a little bit later.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely interesting. So you mentioned the Coromantees, and so when people say that word or when that term is used, it's not specifically referencing a specific ethnic group, but it's referencing all the people that came from Ghana. Is that correct?
From the southern half mainly.
From the southern half. Okay. And so I know for me, what I hear often in terms of like the cultures in Jamaica that are closely linked or tied to some of the ethnic groups in Ghana is the Maroons.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like there's this huge cultural connection there. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the Maroons, their history, very, very linked with Ghana and Ghanaians, particularly the Akan and Fanti. They actually started mashing up the racial order as soon as they got on slave ships. Like Akan people were rebelling on the way to the Americas. Like there were several revolts on slave ships before they even got to Jamaica in the late 1600s, early 1700s. And so by the time they got to Jamaica, they were already ready to dismantle the slave regime. And so they kind of started in St. Anne, which that set of people ended up becoming the Compound Maroons. And then there was another set of people that ended up going to the eastern side of Jamaica that was led by Nanny. So there was like two groups of sort of Coromanti people in Jamaica who started like Maroon societies. And really and truly, their history is just like, it always just like brings me so much like the feelings I don't even know how to describe because oftentimes like in history in the West, we're not really told the ways in which people resisted and how much they resisted, but the people who were to become the Maroons, like they were mashing up plantations, burning plantations, bringing people along with them. And they were mostly Cromanti. And so for a lot of Jamaicans, they when they hear Cromanti, when they think about our history, that is the first thing they think about. There's this sort of undeniable mark that Chromanti people have that left on the psyche of modern day Afro-Jamaicans that when we think about like resisting colonialism, we think about Akan people. And it's because of the people who were to become the Maroons who set off a lot of slave revolts in the early 1600s and leading into the mid 1700s before they signed the first Maroon Treaty. And so, yeah, the Maroons, their history is just very, very, very powerful in terms of how they use so much strategy that they've learned in Ghana and they brought to Jamaica and essentially became a free people on that island through fighting the British. The British and other European empires as well, people who were there in Jamaica, like some Spanish folk and whatever. So
Yeah, and like I was reading one of your posts and then about ethnic stereotypes, and you had mentioned that the Cromantes or people from Gold Coast were seen as resistors and quote
mm-hmm,
unquote aggressive. Um,
mm-hmm,
and hearing you speak about the Maroons, I see that kind of like connection of people that were, resisting, fighting, that kind of
mm-hmm,
thing. But obviously the Europeans, they don't like that. So they label you as aggressive. And
mm-hmm.
so what is that impact then in Jamaica? Like what is how and I know you touched on this, but how are the Maroons viewed in terms of like, being people that resisted and
Yeah.
having that label of aggressive put onto them?
Yeah, so there are people who kind of view the Maroons in sort of this anti-Black way because they sort of see them as like kind of like, because the expression of Akan culture is so in your face, there's sort of like this anti-Black interaction that some Jamaicans have with Maroons. Now, there's other people who, of course, admire the Maroons because of that history. Although not all Maroon history is like pretty, in terms of like the resisting aspect is what a lot of Jamaicans really do appreciate. And just the overall connection we have with the Khan people that non-Maroons and Maroons share, because we also had Tachi's War that happened in the mid 1700s that was initiated by somebody who was probably Ga, who came from Accra, who started a rebellion on the eastern side of the island that expanded to the western side of the island all at the same time. So our link with people who are not Maroons, our link with them is like the foundation of the Akan people setting off rebellion in Jamaica. So for a lot of us, we really do appreciate that. But of course, you have anti-Black people who they don't business about any of that.
Yeah. And so, you know, we see those historical connections and links between Jamaica and Ghana. And so, in terms of today, what kinds of cultural similarities do you see between the two countries in terms of music, food, spirituality? And of course, I'm specifically talking about Afro-Jamaicans and Ghanaians. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's really so much when it comes to like food. I didn't know this whole time that like when I eat rice and peas, that's just basically a version of wache, which is so cool because like it looks similar, like the spices are there. Our patty is basically meat pie. Market systems, how that's like really spearheaded by women, how women have played a huge role in like the economics of our communities. That's a really ancient thing for us as African people, and that's something that was really prevalent in the Gold Coast as well as in Jamaica historically. And so that is a real cool connection. But one thing that I think about often when it comes to like Akan history in Jamaica is like language, especially when it comes to like plants, because the way in which Akan people like named a lot of the plants in Jamaica, how they gave that language, kind of just tells me how in tune with the environment our ancestors were. Even on plantations, like that know-how that they had in Akan land, they transferred over into Jamaica and have given us sort of our understanding of our world around us, like our physical world around us. I think that's like so cool to know like, okay, I recognize this plant from back home. I'm gonna name this plant what I call it in my language. Like that takes a level of like skill and like know-how that I just really appreciate when it comes to like yams or different plants that we use for like medicine or like our traditions, that sort of thing. I think that's so cool. And even on a musical level, like in terms of like performing arts, I'm actually like learning about like this instrument that they use that some of the Maroons use on the eastern side of the island. It's called the Adoa. Adjoa. I might be saying it wrong. And I think that's in connection to kete music, like a kete dance from like the Akan. I know it's like this metal instrument that they use, like they kind of bang together. And that's sort of what the Adjoa means in one of the Maroons language. And so I'm actually looking to that right now. And that's actually really cool because that's such a big part of like a lot of Akan sounds, sort of that
Yeah.
um, yeah, I'm learning about that right now. So that's another connection. But I mean, I could go on and on, really and truly.
Yeah, like the music, I think it's a huge thing because like Jamaica has influenced Ghana so much in terms of like Ghanaian music, right? And so you see a lot of like artists, Ghanaian artists that are heavily influenced by dance hall, incorporating elements of that into their music. And so I see like that influence there as well. And just in terms of like historical figures kind of coming together. It's like you
Yeah.
see, it's not just like one way, it's like we both influence each other in different
Yeah.
ways. And so,
Yeah.
it's so prevalent, and it's amazing. Like, I love seeing the connection between Jamaica and Ghana.
And I think that's like really beautiful that like the way in which we influence each other is that like historical connection. Like you have people who you're already tied to being somebody like a group of people that have influenced like your modern culture. I think that's like really powerful. You know, like we are already connected, and for people to like really appreciate that and like lean into that, I don't think it's coincidence really. Like
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think, was it the last time I went to Ghana? Like, you see Jamaican flags here and there, and I'm like, oh, that's
wow.
so dope. Yeah.
Wow, that
Ghanaians
and
definitely love Jamaica. Like, it's, it's super dope to see. And in terms of the spirituality aspect,
mm,
do you see any sort of similarities? Are you
mhm.
kind of familiar with that sort of indigenous or African spiritual system in Jamaica? And do you see any similarities between that and Ghana? I know Ghana, we have a variety of different spiritualities, but I know you've been speaking mostly about the Akan spirituality. So if you can speak to that, that would be great as well.
Yeah, the basis of like maroon like religions and stuff like that comes from Ghana. Like who they revere is connected. Like even like some of the same names, like even this podcast, Asase is a name that the Maroons recognize in their repertoire of like religion. Um and even like subtle things like cotton trees, how the significance of a cotton tree. I believe I was reading how cotton trees have significance in southern Ghana. There's just so much with that as well. But of course, like Jamaica banned African traditional religions in 1760s because of the Tachi's War and how that played a role in like fighting the British. So the way in which people express that is oftentimes I don't want to say suppressed, but it's away from like public view. So accessing that information is like harder. But when it comes to like the names of certain like I don't know if deities is the right word or gods, but the names
Yeah.
of them
Yeah,
are like,
bosom.
yeah, it's all the same.
In Ghana too, there is a big Christian population, and although the traditional religions are definitely demonized, and yeah, it's definitely demonized, people call any of that stuff witchcraft, that kind of
Right,
thing. So
right,
there's definitely that stigma there too, but in a way it's also kind of syncretized with some of the Abrahamic religions,
right.
right? So it's like what are we actually doing? Like why are there pastors going to see these akonfo, you know what I mean? So
Uh-huh.
right,
Yeah, we
why are they
have
going to
those as
see these
well.
traditional priests and priestesses? So it's interesting.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
another one that escaped my brain. It was the we call them kumfo, the kumfos
Oh, so yeah,
among the
that's
Maroon.
that's definitely similar. So in Chi, or like in Akan culture, the people, the priestess, priests, they're called akomfo.
Yeah,
And so yeah, that's what that is. So
yep,
that's
for
really
sure.
interesting. Yeah. Also, in terms of more similarities, I know like Ghana and Jamaica, both colonized by the British, who also introduced these Victorian era laws that criminalized queer and trans folks. And so, in Ghana, like there's a lot of anti-LGBT sentiment, and currently they've proposed a bill to try to criminalize queer and trans folks even further. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of these Victorian era laws that criminalized queer and trans folks, what's the impact that law and those laws have had in Jamaica and also among the Jamaican diaspora?
Whew. So yeah, it's just sad really because like you said, these laws were introduced literally by the British. Like these are colonial laws, and unfortunately has made such a huge impact on Jamaica and Jamaicans that our country's literally associated with like queer phobia. Like it's in the music, it's in language. Like people can't even say the word fish. They have to call those type of animals swim arounds or whatever because the word fish is basically a word for queer people. We also have another word called chichi or chichi man, which is liking queer people to bugs. So this is all like colonial stuff that again, I think has everything to do with the fact that A, they banned ATRs in 1760s. B, Jamaica has the most churches per like square mile than anywhere else in the world. I read somewhere. So the influence of like the church, and just colonial thing really has taken over, and so now people have this sort of aversion for queerness, such that now people are not able to, like queer and trans people are not able to kind of just meet their basic needs. Like acquiring housing is a hassle. There's hassles in healthcare, just everyday life. It's literally systemic oppression because of that legacy. But, the irony is that, because our culture comes from places where there isn't this rigidity on terms of like how you express yourself and who you are, um, a lot of vestiges from times where we were not impacted by that colonial thing shows up in a lot of our traditions, like from our masquerades to some of our traditional dances. You see that there. Um, and I think that's so funny because when we look to our African traditions and things that we do as Black people, we see, okay, like there's space for queer and trans people. But when we talk about any other thing outside of that space, then that's when the queer and transphobia really heightens, and that gender binary is really enforced on us. Um, and so it's terrible.
Yeah, it's like, where's that cognitive dissonance coming from?
Right.
I definitely understand what you mean by that. It's like you can, show or display um the ambiguity to some extent. I mean, we're
Mm-hmm.
still heavily policed looking a
Right.
certain way, but as long as you don't talk about it or put a name to it or
Right.
declare it, yeah, I've definitely seen
Right.
that within Ghanaian mainstream culture as well. So
Right. Like I totally catch your drift. And that's
yeah,
like literally everywhere, like on the continent. Like,
right. Yeah, exactly. And so in terms of your research and building out the content and the history information on your platform, what's your process and where
mm,
do you get your information from?
yeah, so it's like a multi-process sort of thing because I value oral traditions. I also value what I can get from like documents, and I also value like my lived experience as well as other Jamaicans and African people's experience. So I kind of draw from all three. I talk to people across the diaspora so that I can learn about a culture that I'm connecting our culture with, and getting their perspective and their sort of understanding of it, as like I guess, a primary source. And then I draw from my lived experience and as well as other Jamaicans' lived experience. Um, and then I also use sort of like documents from history, to kind of like confirm all of that stuff, even though it doesn't need confirmation from those documents. It's really cool to see sort of like the evolution or like the progression of like a cultural thing that's been written since like the mid 1700s. Like, um, for example, sort of some of our traditions like dances, being documented on like slavers' memoirs. I think that's really cool to see that we could connect that with actual dances that are practiced on the continent, or even how we carry like food and things on our head. That's been documented in Jamaica for like a really long time, and of course they do that in Africa. Um, and so that is like my process. So personally, my favorite is, of course, talking to different people around the diaspora. I have like a network of like peers and associates that I kind of like engage with. We share information. We talk about our cultures, our the similarities, the history. I'm getting like a real account of that culture from the actual people, and not, like you said earlier, from like white people who are trying to talk about somebody else's culture that, you know, they've probably colonized. So
Right?
that
Yeah.
that's what I value most. And of course, like oral traditions, which is really important because that's why like the con has had such a big impact on like the Jamaican psyches, because of that oral tradition of like resistance. You have like the Nancy stories, things like that. So that's also extremely important for me as well.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you have a network of other cultural workers or cultural producers that you can, talk to and discuss these things with. I think that's so important. And also, like, just in terms of reading those documents, I know I've seen on your page like you've shared documents where by these colonizers or by these Europeans, where
Mm-hmm.
some of the language and the messaging is just
Hey.
like so anti-Black, and it can be very triggering. So how do you deal with that when you're doing research and
Whew.
reading these potentially triggering racist accounts?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I take breaks, you know, I give myself time. I kind of read them in increments, like I space it out a little bit because, like you said, the language is so blatantly anti-Black that like sometimes my mind can't even wrap around it. So I just kind of give myself breaks, and I also just kind of, you can never mentally prepare yourself from reading that, but I try to just go into reading it knowing that I might see something that is just really wild. Um, but sometimes there's like little nuggets, and they don't eat. And the funny thing is, like, they don't even intend to like illuminate something about our culture. They just want to be anti-Black. But sometimes in the process, they reveal things about Afro-Jamaicans that I use for the page. Like again, mentioning how Afro-Jamaicans would like dance on their free time. And they would essentially do like war dances or like just cultural dances that we see today that kind of like manifest today. So I think those are like really powerful because you didn't meant to like shine light on this beautiful thing that these people are doing. You just wanted to be anti-Black. And here I
Right.
am taking that and using it to empower people today. So that's what makes it all worth it.
Yeah. It's like sometimes you just gotta just take what you can from it and just,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, just try your best to ignore the rest. But
Right.
it's hard though, but it's it's nice that you have like all these other sources, the oral tradition, the network to tap into to augment these accounts, so that's really cool.
One thing I can say as well that I kind of miss is that like even like upon reading these documents, like you actually see where a lot of the oppression that we experience today come from, like in 4K. Like you'll see, wow, this is where that kind of comes from, that sort of anti-Black thought, that like that under like that queer phobia or that ableism or that like classism, that anti-Blackness. This is where this comes from. So that's also a part of it, that like you get like firsthand accounts on like the origins of like a lot of the oppression that we have to unpack while we're doing this historical work too. So I also wanted
Yeah.
to add that as well.
Oh, yeah, that's a good thing to point out. And also, I'm curious, like through your studies and research and reading, um, have you come across any sort of records that specifically talk about queer and trans folks?
So it's tricky because like we said earlier, like it's this thing where people they don't want to name something a thing. So they'll kind of like work their way around it. But like I guess I don't want to say my job, but like the what I do with my platform is I really wanted to kind of like take that and like tie it to the connection with like queerness and transness. Like I said earlier, like masquerades or like certain dances that we do. Like for instance, there's one called Tambo, and like there are literal vintage videos of like gender fluidity being performed. And so, I mean, I'm just putting two and two together. But when I when I looked at the stores that kind of showed that video, they didn't mention any of that. They just said, "Oh, here's the video," and that was it. And people in the comments didn't even like comment or anything. So, it's really me having to like name that for us, because again, the erasure is real and it's
Yeah,
profound. And again, like you said, people are reluctant to name a thing because of that colonialism.
yeah,
But
that's
yeah,
so
there's
true.
definitely things there that I've seen historically.
Yeah. And what has been, I guess, the reception, for your platform? I'm sure, like, I mean, someone like me, when I came across it, I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. Like, you're so like thorough, a lot of history. I'm learning so much. It's so interesting. So what
Hmm.
has been the kind of like reception, um, in terms of other Jamaicans or just Black people in the diaspora as a whole?
Yeah. And I was actually thinking about this before I joined the podcast because um generally it's a positive reception. Like a lot of people really appreciate the work. They really are glad that they're seeing this sort of history that's in depth with also that added analysis on like systems of oppression, how that impacts like us learning history. But then also sometimes you have people because of course I don't show my face or I don't really talk about myself as much. I do like mention queer phobia, transphobia, ableism, all these things. Um, some like pretty often. However, sometimes when people find out that I'm trans, their interaction with the page diminishes. They don't really talk to me as much. They don't engage the page as much. They don't like posts as much. So that interaction diminishes. And I really just feel like that have everything to do with like power dynamics. And again, like who people actually want to hear when it comes to like retelling history, that like there are definitely identities that are not only silenced within history, but even as we're retelling the history now, that people would much rather get their history from like men or like straight people or
Mhm.
identities that hold like systemic power. And so I definitely noticed like a switch up when people find out about who is actually running the page sometimes. But generally, people are very like, they love the page and the work that comes from it. Yeah.
Yeah, including myself. I love it. And I
Thank you.
was looking forward to seeing more and hearing more. Is it a conscious choice for you to kind of like, be more just focus more on a platform and speak less about yourself or show your identity? Is that kind of
Yeah.
like a way of just maybe protecting yourself, or is there another reason?
Yeah, that's mainly it because really and truly, I I really do notice that like the more privilege that you have in the society is like that definitely carries over into how people receive information from you. And that like people who are marginalized often are not heard. And so upon like people engaging a marginalized person, that sort of excitement that they at first felt kind of goes away. And so I really just kind of want to stick to like the history, not like get into myself as much or like show personal stuff, because I think the reception would not be as what it is now, at least. And so that's like a conscious effort of mine. But I do try to like, add some personal tidbits here and there. But just because the atmosphere of queerphobia is just so great among Jamaicans that I'm definitely cautious.
Yeah. And so, where can people find this amazing work that you're doing, and drop any social media platforms that you want to share?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram, Root in a Jamaica. That is spelled ROOTINAJUMIEKA. That is my only platform. I'm also on TikTok, but I'm working on that a little bit. TikTok is a bit overwhelming for me. But I really
I
want
feel
to.
that. Yeah, I try to create one and I'm like, oh, I don't have the energy right now to
Exactly.
keep up with that.
It's like a lot.
Yeah.
But the reception there, I see is pretty good. But I don't know if I have the time for that one. But I'm probably gonna not transition, but I'm gonna add some posts on there. But I'm mainly on Instagram. You can find me at Rootin' and Jamaica on Instagram. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Moco, for joining me today. This was really great. And I can't wait for everyone to listen to this. So exciting.
Yes. Yes. Again, thank you for having me. I love your platform. Like it's so important. So important. So yeah, I'm super happy that I was here today.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Wasn't it amazing? I loved it. And Moco's information is in the episode notes, so check it out below. And you can still join in on the conversation. #asasebapod. Okay, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.